Thank you. So I'll just start then.
Yes, please.
Okay, the French writer Aimé Michel used to write explicitly and often about la pensée surhumaine, that is superhuman thinking. He meant something very sophisticated by the phrase, something that emerged gradually from a serious and lifelong engagement with saints, miracles, parapsychological phenomena, mystical literature, and UFOs. He used to joke that when one studies the UFO, one begins with physics and astronomy and ends up studying Arabic mystics. One begins with machines and mechanisms and ends up with meaning, or better still, a distinctly mystical kind of not knowing or being so. Similarly, the UFO is often talked about today as if it is a simple object or common thing, a threat in the nation's sky, perhaps, maybe, but it is also far more than this. These appearances, after all, commonly violate, offend, or transcend the very divisions we make between subjects and objects. Perhaps even more telling, they also often have a reflective or interactive quality. That is, they appear to human beings as those human beings expect them to appear, often in the mythological or folklore guise of the respective place and time. It is not then that the UFO is a simple object that will someday be explained with our dualistic logic, grammar, and science. Rather, or so I want to suggest, we have to move outside or to the side of our present order of knowledge to begin to understand what is happening. As Hussein Ali Agrama has argued so convincingly, we will have to let go of our secular and scientific categories, which don't really work here. We will have to let go of the machines in the sky and get to the mystics. Not that they will have the answer either, but at least we will be on the right track or in the right dark. Let me begin then by stating definitively that no one is an expert here. No one. That's the first thing I want to say. I am always asked the question, so what do you think the UFO is? I always answer back, I do not know, but I know this. I know that anyone who says they know does not know. Certainty is either a lie or a function of ignorance or misinformation here. For my own part, I have been thinking and writing about the UFO phenomenon as a historian of religions since about 2004. I first struggled with it because I had to. It was simply everywhere in my historical and ethnographic sources, with which I was working for a big history of alternative spiritual currents in the California counterculture. My own interest began there at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. People commonly assumed at that point that the UFO was not serious or was some kind of New Age or California thing. This is not entirely wrong, since the New Age movement in fact took the UFO phenomenon quite seriously. Some scholars of the New Age have even argued, quite convincingly in my opinion, that particular currents or strands of these esoteric movements began among UFO contactees of a particular theosophical persuasion in the 1950s. This fits the case of Ken Arnold, for example, whose family story sounds very theosophical to my ear. There are also contemporary scholars who link theosophy and the UFO, especially the Swedish scholar and archivist Håkan Blomqvist. There are even humorous postcards in our archival collection here at Rice University to this effect. That is, that comedically identify flying saucers as Californians. Well, that is funny, but it is not really true, and it has never been true. The phenomenon in the US has been frankly everywhere. Some of the earliest and most dramatic documented modern encounters have been around nuclear military sites around the country, as the Congress hearings of May of 2022 gave clear witness. New Mexico has played a special role as well, particularly in the summer of 1945, just a few miles from the recently radiated Trinity atomic bomb site, and just a week after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As has New England. The latter region boasts the first iconic American case involving a mixed-race couple who were also civil rights activists. Chicago's O'Hare Airport was the place of one of the most puzzling and famous saucer sightings of the early millennium. And the indigenous communities of the Americas are filled with UFO lore, as well as is Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Other signature cases have occurred in cultures like Africa, Australia, the Czech Republic, England, France, Japan, Romania, and Russia. The UFO is also everywhere in Islamic science fiction and its various astrobiological visions, in language and cultures as distinct as Arabic, Bengali, Malay, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu. To put an accent on things, the UFO phenomenon is a global phenomenon. Although, of course, its reporting and mythological framing is always relative, uneven, and contingent on surrounding cultural influences. Not that the UFO is simply cultural. It is not. To study the UFO adequately is, in actual fact, to study pretty much everything. It is also to come up against hard the realization that the institutional or university order of knowledge, what Mike calls the conventional order of knowledge, within which we work and think today, an order that effectively splits the sciences off from the humanities, is simply not helpful, and certainly not reflective of the reality we are trying to understand. The difficult truth is that the UFO phenomena has both an objective hard aspect, think fighter jet videos, photographs, alleged metamaterials, apparent advanced propulsion methods, and landing marks, and a subjective human aspect, think close encounters, multiple and coordinated visual sightings, altered states of consciousness, visionary displays, and experience traumatic or transcendent abductions. And both sides, both the material and the mental dimensions, are important to get a sense of the full or fuller picture. The essential doubleness of the UFO phenomena became particularly obvious in the secret US government studies contracted by Robert Bigelow, the aerospace entrepreneur in Las Vegas, Nevada. Very much in the doubleness I am trying to articulate here, Mr. Bigelow has been a major supporter and funder of research into both the alien presence and the experienced reality of the afterlife, UFOs and souls. It is simply not possible to read about the stunning insider's accounts of the still classified research program that Mr. Bigelow contracted with the US government and not confront this doubleness head on. Indeed, 3 of these insiders to this secret US government research contracted by Robert Bigelow go to great lengths in their co-authored Skinwalkers at the Pentagon to describe and discuss things like what they call the hitchhiker effect. The latter phenomena involves military and intelligence professionals apparently being infected with occult presences on Skinwalker Ranch in Utah and bringing the phenomena back home, literally, to their East Coast families, for example, in Virginia. Kelleher, for example, who holds a PhD in biochemistry and an extensive background in cancer research and immunology, theorizes the human witness as a kind of biochemical readout instrument, whose immunological system is particularly sensitive to these hidden presences and forces. Colm Kelleher, with whom I worked on an advisory board for Mr. Bigelow, is explicit about what Skinwalkers at the Pentagon calls blue orbs. The latter are basically intelligent balls of plasma that interact with humans, often at close range, and occasionally penetrate their bodies, sometimes with cancerous effects. Of course, one can slice up the UFO phenomena into the scientific and the humanistic or the historical. but one will never understand it by doing so. That in the end is why I think the subject is so incredibly important. It bears a particular power to challenge or just abolish our present order of knowledge and its arbitrary divisions. Whatever it is, it simply does not behave according to our rules and philosophical assumptions, any of them. Still, there are good reasons to focus on the hard physical aspect. That's what the public, after all, can actually hear. The recent release, along with the leaked radio video dating back to December of 2017 that was so effectively reported in the New York Times by Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper, has fundamentally changed the public conversation around the topic. Serious researchers are no longer looked on with quite so much contempt, and the dogmatic debunkers no longer have the upper hand. The bad news involves the nature of the erratic and classified dribbling out of the data. The refusal of the US government to release the goods, as it were, and so give serious researchers full access to all of the material. By dribbling out the evidence, the militaries and government are essentially trying to control the narrative. I am not advancing a conspiracy theory here. I am not suggesting any sinister motive. I am simply advancing an argument about truly serious and effective research, whether that is in the sciences or the humanities. My complaint, I suppose, can be captured in the folky wisdom that, quote, if all you have is a hammer, all you will see are nails. In this context, since the data is being collected by military professionals whose primary purpose is to protect the nation state from intruders or enemies, fair enough, the UAP or UFO is inevitably framed in terms of potential threats. I mean, the videos we are watching were taken by the radar systems of advanced fighter jets designed to do one thing: shoot down an enemy object. Is it any wonder that these filmed objects are being framed literally and metaphorically as threats? Allow me to speak from the humanities here, by which I do not mean, as my colleague Timothy Morton jokes, the humanities as, quote, candy sprinkles on the cake of science, unquote. I am not here to drop candy sprinkles on a cake. I am here to say something about that cake, and maybe it's eating. Take science fiction as a literary genre and film. Here we repeatedly find what I would call the Cold War invasion mythology that has been so dominant and about which, for example, Greg has spoken earlier this morning. In this mythology, the UFO is seen as an alien invasion. By the word alieniste in French used to refer to mental illness. And of course, the illegal alien to this day is a kind of feared immigrant. So there's already these fears or anxieties around something coming from outside the borders. Think, for example, of H.G. Wells' 1897 novel, War of the Worlds, an invasion story, by the way, inspired by British colonialism. Wells had read of the overwhelming technological and military force of the British colonialists in New Guinea, and he wanted to imagine what a similar overwhelming force would be like in England. Or on the American side, think the movie Independence Day from 1996. There were more hopeful signs early on in the movies. For example, in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977, which orbited around a widely shared telepathic precognition of Devil's Mountain. But these early paranormal hopes were dashed in 1,000 scary invasion stories that came after. Only very recently have writers and filmmakers begun to move away from this Cold War invasion mythology and towards something much more positive and frankly, much more faithful to what we actually see in the encounter and contact cases, if we really studied them, as opposed to just assuming things about them. Hence a recent movie by a Canadian director, significantly enough, like Arrival in 2016. The latter movie borders on the profound, since it orbits lovingly and contemplatively around the paranormal transformations of its central character, a gifted humanist linguist, Dr. Louise Banks. And indeed, in historical fact, human witnesses are often radically transformed by their encounters, often in extremely positive, if confusing ways. Such encounters, for example, can be of a deeply spiritual nature, by which I do not mean good or nice. People experience awe, fear, uncanniness, and absolute terror. The Harvard psychiatrist John Mack rightly called this ontological shock. They experience either within the event itself or later develop new astonishing abilities, think telepathy and precognition, and they adopt new, much more cosmic worldviews. Hence, in the film, Dr. Louise Banks develops the ability to precognize the future. She essentially remembers the early and tragic death of her daughter, who is not yet born. As she gradually learns that time, like the grammar of the alien language she is deciphering, is circular, not linear. This is an idea about space-time, by the way, that is well known to humanists, from ancient Greek philosophy through Friedrich Nietzsche to the block universe of contemporary cosmology. My point? That we should be approaching the UFO phenomena much more like Arrival and much less like War of the Worlds or Independence Day. But we can't seem to do that. Instead, we go on and on about potential threats and enact endless security and secrecy measures. And then we wonder why no one understands this. As a result of these actions, the human witnesses, their sightings, their transformations, and their traumas are arrogantly ignored and disdained as anecdotal and so unworthy of study. I confess that I despise the snarkiness of that word, anecdotal, and the way it shuts down full inquiry. Every human experience, after all, is technically anecdotal. In this sense, I too am an anecdote. So are you. We all are. And yet there is no science or mathematics, no literature, language, art, or religion, and there is certainly no UFO without that human subject, without that anecdotal witness, thinker, or seer. So why are we not talking about the experiences of those human witnesses and how the phenomena seems to trigger or catalyze the human imagination in fantastic ways? I know many of us are. Why are we not compassionately reading those imaginal dramas as meaningful signs instead of arrogantly ignoring them as neurological froth? Why are we not talking about what happens to the terrified pilots or the baffled military professionals or the confused private citizens who see things, sometimes really up close and very, very personally? Is that not also part of the UFO phenomena? Why are we looking away, and from what? There's always more. I would like to begin to conclude by suggesting that the most sophisticated piece of technology on the planet to detect non-human or superhuman presences is not a quantum computer or an advanced military radar system. It is the human body, brain, and being. I would also like to suggest that the human being has been detecting strange humanoid presences in the sky and the environment, not for years or a few decades, but for millennia. All we have to do is open our proverbial eyes and look. All we have to do is put away our hammer and look carefully at our histories, our literatures, and most of all, our religions. On this new big humanist and historical canvas, what we are encountering in the sky and seeing from the ground today will take on fundamentally new meanings and future possibilities. Like many of us, I do not claim to know what those meanings and futures will be. And I certainly do not believe any of the reigning mythologies, be they political, secular, scientific, or religious. but I am betting they will have very little to do with the assessment of threats. That's the Cold War mythology that it is time to move beyond. So why will we never explain the UFO? Because the UFO is not something that can be explained in our human cognitive sense-based ways of knowing. It is also something that lies before or beyond the way our organisms, our bodies and brains, split up reality into a mental and material dimension. This is why the history of comparative mystical literature is so very important here, because it teaches us that reality is not dualistic like this, and that the real is not something that our thinking or sensing or knowing can capture in any intentional or dualistic way. Reality is not out there, as we say, nor is it in here, by the way. It is something else entirely beyond us, before us, to the side of us. There are mediations, of course, between this out and this in. We generally refer to them as expressions of our imagination, but we have no real model of the imagination other than the imaginary. We think this is froth. We think this is only social construction. I think this is devastatingly simplistic. Ultimately, I think the imagination is another word for consciousness, which the UFO encounters strongly suggest is not entirely bound to space and time. Certainly, we cannot fully theorize something like consciousness, and for a very simple reason: we are it. The I cannot I itself, but such an I can, if comparative mystical literature means what I think it means, come to know itself as so. As the famous line from the medieval German Christian professor had it, the I with which I see God is the same I with which God sees me. Please note that I am definitely not suggesting the UFO is psychological or only a matter of the mental. I am working with a very different ontology that is neither mental nor material, but both at the same time. The radar is real, so is the revelation. The eye of consciousness, the eye of God, which in this view is also the eye of the physical cosmos, can also come to appreciate the movies it throws up on its own historical and cultural screens, special physical effects and all. It can believe them, as it long has in human history. But the same consciousness also knows that it is not ultimately those movies, however convincing they may seem at times, however physical they get, and so it can disbelieve them. Both responses, belief and unbelief, are perfectly understandable. I wish us to do both, not one or the other. Please do not slot me into your either or thinking. I do not belong there, and I wish to be heard as not there, because I am not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Really, really excellent. Thank you so much. A lot for us to think about there. Jeff, I really appreciate this perspective you're adding to this discussion, bringing in the mystical literature. I think this is a really very interesting, fascinating aspect. Thank you so much again. I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague Michael, who has a question for you, Jeff. If we can get this started off here by a question from Michael Silverstein. You're on.
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sure.
Thank you for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. So I'm just trying to sort of think about everyone's talk together and yours in particular. So to summarize, it seems very clear. I think skeptic or not skeptic, anybody can grant that whether it's the limits of top-down cognition, social historical bias, narratives that we get from all sorts of places, governmental and otherwise, our worldview, biases about materialism or physicalism, all this stuff can radically affect how we perceive, how we experience, and how we theorize. I mean, I'm hoping anyone would grant that much. But But it seems to me at the end of the day, those of us that want to move beyond skepticism, there is some, however it may be outside of all those biases, there are some facts about what's going on. So even, for example, and we want to move beyond so it's all good to keep all this in the back of our head, but we want to move beyond that and try to have a deeper understanding of what's happening. Can we fully transcend all these biases? Of course not, but we can still have a deeper understanding. And so even when you take, and I'm not unsympathetic to the sort of neutral monist imaginarium idea you were suggesting, right? But those sorts of perspectives are going to be true about everything, including tables and chairs. And in other words, it's not just UAP phenomena that you rethink or reconceptualize with that point of view. But the question is, just to go with your point, even if you go in that direction, you can simultaneously say UAPs are part of the engineering, but there's also really ships flying around there, and radar bounces off of it, right? I mean, if you're monist, those are not mutually exclusive claims,
Right.
or something in that department. And you're also very aware that when we consider these traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism, we got to be careful using the word mystical traditions, because aside from their very phenomenological experiences, agreement about what happens, right, in certain states of meditation or psychedelics or whatever, they had violent disagreements about how to interpret those experiences. So you're very aware, in Buddhism and Hinduism, you had atomists, you had Advaita Vedanta, you know what I'm saying? So yeah. You're very aware that the experience, and you pointed it out, doesn't fix the interpretation. It's still underdetermined. So my question is, how do we move forward? Suppose we move to this imaginarium idea or whatever. How do we unify all these sorts of approaches in ways that are helpful to one another? And how does it help us move beyond our biases?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is going to sound simplistic, Michael, but I think the first way to move forward is to simply keep things on the table and to stop saying things like these things don't happen, or, this is some kind of delusion or some kind of projection. I really believe that if intellectuals and scientists can keep things on their table, then they can reshuffle things and come up with new models about what's happening. And I think the neutral monism, or the dual aspect monism that you're referring to there, to me, that's just a thought experiment that keeps more things on the table. I don't know if that's the answer, but I know this Cartesian dualism that we appear to be objectifying in a cultural way, I think is the problem. And I think it's why people take things off the table, because in that ontological or metaphysical framework, these things actually cannot happen. And so what people say is they can't happen, and therefore they don't. They confuse the assumed philosophical position or with reality. And I think reality is constantly violating those assumptions, and in a very trickster-like or confusing way to us. So my point is, well, let's experiment with other ontologies. Let's experiment with other models and see what works and what doesn't. So that would be my answer to that. And this event, by the way, that Mike has organized, I mean, to me, this is what it's about. I mean, this conversation and this debate. I mean, I don't think any of us individually know what's going on, but I think together we can put our heads together and read each other and come to some better models that probably aren't going to solve or explain it either.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
So,
and Michael, the reason I'm so interested in comparative mystical literature is it's so incredibly suspicious of our sense-based cognitive abilities. I think people are always confusing cognition and consciousness. And I think that's just a devastating mistake. And the comparative mystical literature does not do that. It does not confuse thinking with being, to put it in more traditional terms.
So, did you want to respond?
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what you said. I appreciate your answer. But
Yeah.
here's an analogy I often think of as somebody who's been meditating and doing psychedelics for most of the renewed interest and at all levels, scientific and otherwise, about psychedelics, right? And of course, I lived through some of the original. But so you talk about, so now you can go on YouTube and you can watch thousands of people who are crazy enough to smoke DMT and report back, right?
Right.
Any help or any shock. And they often report wild experiences that often have a lot of intersubjective similarity. And so even then, and of course that has all kinds of value and meaning and interest, irrespective of how veridical you think they are. But
Yeah.
even as a person who's had these experiences, I always think to myself, but wouldn't it be nice if we really could marry science and psychonauts, right? Like we really still want to figure out, like, is there something here going on that we really need, their beings or reality, right? You still want to turn it into not you can't reduce everything about science now. I'm not saying that, but we still want to make it as sciencey as possible, even if it transfigures what we mean by science. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the science is fine as long as it recognizes its limitations. Where I get worried is where people confuse science with reality.
I agree.
So we're just about at the point where your talk could have stopped, which is great. So we're on time. I have to turn this discussion over to our primary discussant, who is Professor Babbage from Fordham. Professor Babbage, I apologize for that little interlude, but can we turn it over to you for commentary and then perhaps some questions?
Oh, well, it's very difficult to comment on an absolutely extraordinary presentation, tour de force, and of course also because the first thing that happened when I shared the news that I was doing this on Facebook, immediately students wrote to me to say, oh, I know Jeff Kripal, which is, of course, not the first thing you want to hear because you're thinking, but who? And I didn't know and don't necessarily know the work. But of course, once looking, because my interest was piqued, I looked at his website and then I followed and realized, oh my gosh, I should certainly have known about this for all of this time. But of course, certainly I did not. The presentation speaks for itself. And of course, any presentation that is as logically careful as Jeff's presentation was, emphasizes the question of limit and thereby gives itself a consummate free pass. So there's really no place to come in and say, yeah, but what about? Because it's already been allowed for. And so I'm a student of rhetoric because I am a Nietzschean. So I'm aware of exactly what language can do, well beyond John Austin, if you do it. And I think we just heard how it can be done. I do agree that there is, and Shakespeare already says this very, very well, much more that is going on than we can see. But at the same time, one also has to worry just a little bit about, and I was a student of the Canadian theologian. I took theology for no good reason in grad school, but the Canadian theologian Bernard Lonergan, who spoke about mysticism and effectively persuaded me that there was no real place that you could make a judgment about the mystic for all the good reasons we've just heard. Because of course, a mystic has an actual relationship with the divine and you don't. So there's no third party, there's no science, there's no objectivity that you can bring in to raise questions about whatever the mystic wants to say. So we could go to Medjugorje just as much as we could go to anywhere else and talk to those 3 children, I think they're still alive today, and ask them what it was that they saw. We would have to rely on their word. We would have to keep that open mind. We would have to take their word for it. But then, and here I begin to want to think about the earlier talk by Professor Gabriel de la Torre, because that talk seemed to me quasi beautifully done as well, but also a little schizophrenic, because on the one hand, we can say with Gibson, there are things that we're not getting because of affordances, and on the other hand, we can say these people are obsessed, they're a little crazy. So the mystic has always been assumed to be beautifully crazy, wonderfully crazy, and with that ecstatic ability to go outside of itself. So outside of themselves, and that, and I'm just speaking as a philosopher, not. I just took courses in theology. It didn't make me a theologian, and I'm not an expert in religious studies by any means, but I have great respect. So I speak from and ask that question from a position of respect, well aware of all of the all the flourishes and excellences that I have been very persuaded by. I mean, I'm taken as much by the presentation as I think many participants who added to the chat and went along. To me, I would want to join my friends on Facebook as a fan, but I do have caution, and the caution that I have, the worry that I have, is that where do we then, how do we then begin to speak? If you speak directly to Saint Francis, for example, or indeed to name the names that for very careful reasons, I suppose, Jeff Kripal did not name, if we go and try to go along with the mystical asking of God to free me of God, which Nietzsche quotes of all things, where do we stand? How do we then begin, as by definition third-party observers, to talk to the first party? I mean, that will be the challenge, and that'll take us right back to our first presentation, and that's the historical presentation. So that's a very, very long comment question, but it asks only, where do we stand and how do we go on from here?
So, Mike, do you want me to try to respond to that?
I should just jump in here to say that we have a bit of a time crunch. So respond, and then there's one hand up for another question. So go ahead, Jeff, and then we'll move on to a question.
Okay, so Babette, it's an honor. I've actually read you. I love Nietzsche. So I feel like I'm entering a philosophical conversation. I don't think this is safe. And I don't think it's religiously safe. I don't think religions have the answer here. I think they're historical expressions of similar kinds of experiences. I do adhere to the idea that the UFO phenomena and the history of religions are very much related. Although, of course, the UFO or the flying saucer has a Cold War history in the modern world, but it has a religious history in the past. I don't think those answers work very well for that. I don't think, I grew up Roman Catholic. Bernard Lonegren's kind of an intellectual saint in my tradition. I don't think Catholicism has the answer too. And, Francis of Assisi was penetrated or pierced by some kind of object in the sky. And if you go to Assisi, you can see his bloody socks. And the man died very young, by the way. And so it's kind of creepy, frankly. And I guess I just want to emphasize that creepiness, and that, my argument is that the scientific answers don't work, but neither do the religious answers. And that's, I think, where we begin to answer your question right there, in a kind of state of confusion or not knowing.
Okay, Mark, I think we have time for another question. We have about 5 more minutes.
Yes, the only hand that's up, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, is Raul Berenguel. Yeah. You're on, Raul.
Okay, you are hearing me?
Mhm.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry for my rusty English. Many years without speaking in your language. Is not a question that I want to put to you. First of all, my congratulations for your reasoning. I love your speech, and I want, if you allow me, to give you an advice. You are in a stagnary path. Hello?
Yeah,
Are you hearing me?
we can hear you, sure.
I'm advise you to pursue the way of the reality and to come back to the ancient Greeks. I think Professor Babbitt, as a philosopher, can explain you something about Plato and the notion of the cavern, where the humans see only shadows of the reality. You are in a line. I have 51 years studying UAP phenomena, and I and others here in Portugal think that the right pathway to solve or partially solve this question is by the question of reality. That's my advice to you. I want do not speak further about this issue, but I congratulate you for your extraordinary reasoning, and I think that you should pursue that kind of perspective and immerse deeper in what is reality, because this phenomena is always about reality, and our reality is not the all reality, the true reality. There's another reality that we cannot see. It's like the spectrum, the visible spectrum. We can saw some part of the spectrum, but not all spectrum. So our reality is in the great reality. And this kind of phenomena belongs to the great reality. You are a tiny particle, as I am, of the great reality. If I, in your place, I go through that whole
Professor,
extra
to interrupt.
presentation.
We unfortunately we have to end our session, but thank you
Okay.
for your comment. Thanks to all of our speakers, Professor Kripal, Professor De La Torre, and Professor Akigian. We thank everyone for this wonderful, really fantastic, fascinating first session. Thank you all. We are going.